The lecture hall of the Galactic Interspecies Academy smelled of ozone and alien ambition. 47 students from 23 different worlds sat in curved rows of bioluminescent seats, their varied anatomies arranged in comfortable configurations designed by engineers who had spent decades making sure no species felt excluded. Gelthari floated in suspension pods. Vrethkai students coiled their segmented bodies around sensor pillars. Thervani, four-armed and eight-eyed, perched on reinforced platforms near the back. And then there was Mara Ellison. She sat in the third row, second seat from the left, in a standard chair that had been modified with a cushion because the original surface had been optimized for drone physiology, which involved sitting on one's knees with one's shins folded outward at an angle that would have snapped a human femur in two. She had a datapad, a battered notebook made of actual paper, which had caused 3 separate students to ask if she was carrying skin, and a cup of coffee that she'd had to explain was not a stimulant extract brewed from a parasitic fungus, but was, in fact, just coffee. She had explained this 4 times already this week. It was only Tuesday. Professor Kale Veyron swept into the room the way he always did, all 6 limbs moving in elegant synchrony, his chromatic frills cycling through calm blues and instructional yellows. He was a Shireen, one of the oldest spacefaring species in the known galaxy, and he wore the authority of 10,000 years of academic tradition like a second skin. Today, Professor Kale Veyron announced, settling at the front of the room, his frills fanning wide, we discuss planetary classification. Specifically, he tapped the holographic display behind him, pulling up a rotating model of a lush green-blue sphere, the myth of the Deathworld. Mara's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. Deathworld, Professor Kale Veyron continued, his tone warm and patient, like a teacher explaining to a child that the monster under the bed was not real, is a colloquial term propagated by early explorers and sensationalist xenojournalists. It refers, supposedly, to planets whose native conditions are so extreme as to be lethal to most known life forms. Crushing gravity. Toxic atmospheres. Temperature extremes. Megafauna predators. Biological pathogens with no analog in galactic medicine. He let the words hang in the air like a fine mist. However, modern xenobiology has conclusively demonstrated that no such planet exists. Life, wherever it arises, calibrates to its environment. What early explorers perceived as death conditions were simply unfamiliar conditions. Nothing more. He looked around the room with the benevolent satisfaction of a professor who had just delivered an elegant truth. Mara Ellison raised her hand. Professor Kale Veyron blinked all 4 of his eyes in mild surprise. Students rarely interrupted the opening thesis. Yes, Cadet Ellison? I'm from a death world, Mara said. Her voice was pleasant. Sir. The room went very still. Professor Kale Veyron's frills shifted, a brief flicker of yellow uncertainty, before settling back into authoritative blue. Earth is classified as a Class 3 biotic world, Cadet Ellison. Challenging, certainly. But the death world classification is? A myth, yes, I heard you. Mara set down her coffee cup. I'd like to contest that framing, with respect. There was a sound from the back of the room. One of the Thervani students was whispering to another. The word bold translated clearly across the universal interpreter implants they all wore. Professor Kale Veyron tilted his primary head. You may proceed. Mara stood up. She was not tall by human standards, about 165 centimeters, lean, with the kind of quiet, contained energy that larger species sometimes mistook for passivity until it wasn't. She pulled up her own holographic display from her datapad, projecting it alongside the professor's rotating green sphere. Earth, she said, has a surface gravity of 9.8 meters per second squared. That's roughly 2.4 times the gravity of the galactic habitation average. Every day, without gravity suits, every single creature on my planet is being crushed by a force that would leave most of you unable to stand. We don't notice because evolution built us for it. We don't use gravity suits because we are the gravity suits. She clicked to the next image. Earth's atmosphere is 21% oxygen, a highly reactive gas that, at sufficient concentration, will cause combustion acceleration, cellular oxidative damage, and metal corrosion. We breathe it constantly. We need it to survive. Pull it away and we die in minutes. Give us too much and we also die. We live in the knife's edge of a toxic gas balance and we call it fresh air. Another click. Temperature range on Earth's surface, -89 degrees Celsius to +56 degrees Celsius. In active weather systems, which we call storms, we experience winds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour, electrical discharges of 300 million volts, projectile precipitation in the form of frozen water ice, and events we call tornadoes, which are literally columns of spinning destruction that we watch on news channels and then argue about online. She clicked again. The screen filled with images. A lion. A great white shark. A hippopotamus. A box jellyfish. A cone snail. A mosquito. Megafauna, Mara said calmly. Earth has predators that can run at 120 kilometers per hour, predators that can sense electrical fields, predators with enough bite force to crush reinforced steel alloy, and, she pointed at the mosquito, that one, which is small, almost impossible to detect, carries 17 different species of lethal pathogen, and has killed more humans than every other predator in our history combined. We call it annoying. The room was silent. Professor Kale Veyron had not moved. His frills had gone a color that Mara privately catalogued as uncomfortable beige. Our pathogens, she continued, because she was in it now and there was no reason to stop, mutate fast enough to outpace pharmaceutical development. We have spent the last 2,000 years in a biological arms race with microscopic organisms that evolve on timescales of hours. We don't always win. But we're still here. She clicked off the display. Because we're stubborn. She sat back down. She picked up her coffee. She drank. The silence lasted 6 full seconds, which in a room of 23 species with 23 different comfort tolerances for silence, was approximately 6 seconds longer than usual. Professor Kale Veyron's frills cycled through several colors rapidly. Then he said, slowly, the galactic consensus. The galactic consensus was written, Mara said, not unkindly, by species who visited Earth for an average of 4 planetary rotations, from inside shielded observation vessels, and left before the rainy season. She tilted her head. Sir. A sound rippled through the room. It took Mara a moment to identify it because it came from 23 different vocal configurations, but it was laughter. Or the species-specific equivalents of it. One of the gelthari in the suspension pods made a bubbling, resonant sound. Of Rethkai students' bioluminescent patches flashed rapidly, that species' version of sharp amusement. Even 2 of the stone-faced drone, whose emotional expressions required a scanning spectrometer to detect, had shifted their pigmentation in a way that the universal translator flagged as appreciative. Professor Kale Veyron stood very still. Then, slowly, his frills, those elegant, century-trained frills of calm academic authority, shifted to a color Mara had not yet seen from him. Bright, genuine gold. Curiosity. Cadet Ellison, he said, and his voice had changed, not embarrassed, but engaged, the way a scientist sounds when a theory has just been beautifully complicated. I would like to revise the structure of today's lecture. I'd like that too, sir, Mara said. Would you be willing to speak further? On the subject of Earth? I've got 2 more hours of material just on the fungi, she said. And I haven't even started on the ocean. Another ripple moved through the room. The Thervani in the back, all 8 eyes, leaned forward simultaneously. Professor Kale Veyron gestured for her to come to the front. Mara Ellison stood up again, picked up her coffee, and walked to the front of a lecture hall that contained 47 students from 23 worlds, all of whom were suddenly urgently curious about a small blue planet that their own civilization had dismissed as merely challenging. She set down her cup. She pulled up the next image on her datapad. The deep ocean. Black water. The kind of darkness that hadn't seen sunlight in 4,000 meters. Something moved in the image. Enormous. Bioluminescent. Ancient. Okay, Mara Ellison said, and smiled the particular smile of someone who grew up on a planet that tried to kill her every day and never quite managed it. Let's talk about home. Humanity, we call the monsters wildlife. We call the poison air. We call the death world Tuesday. And we miss it when we leave.